All right, so today we are going to cover the endocrine system. The endocrine system is actually one of the most important systems in your body. It is responsible for controlling just about everything that you do. So this little picture here is just kind of a mind or a word map showing all the different things that the endocrine system affects. And so that's going to include, your growth and development, neurologic maturation. It's going to include your regulation of your blood pressure, of your blood sugar. So all the really important functions in your body are going to be controlled by the endocrine system. So when we talk endocrine, we're really talking cell signaling. And that's really what it comes down to. Endocrine is a way of communicating that has to do with using hormones, essentially. So back in the beginning when we were talking about cell signaling, we were saying that cells can communicate with each other in multiple different ways. So you have your paracrine signaling, which is cells to other local cells. You have neurocrine signaling, which is basically at your synaptic cleft, where you're sending out neurotransmitters. Autocrine signaling, where the cell is actually communicating with itself. And then endocrine signaling, which is a gland releases a hormone that goes out and about and tells other cells in the body to do certain things. So when we talk about the endocrine system, endo just simply means within, and crine means to secrete. So you're secreting within. There are many, many glands throughout the body that make up the endocrine system. And when we talk about endocrine, we're talking about both cells and organs. So there's organs of the endocrine system, there's also cells of the endocrine system. And the endocrine system basically is going to use hormones, like I said, to regulate growth and development, metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, all your fluid balances, and your response to stress. So when we talk about hormones, hormones are essentially blood-borne chemicals that affect other cells that are basically anatomically distant from the place where the hormone is released. So the hormone's released in one place, it has an effect in a completely different part of the body. We classify these into two categories, and that's water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones. Hormones, again, are always going to be peptides, basically proteins. So some of these are going to be water-soluble, they're going to float around in the water. Others are going to be lipid-soluble, meaning that they can pass through the cell membrane, which is a lipid bilayer, far more easily than a water-soluble hormone, which is going to require some sort of a transmitter. This is just a picture kind of showing where a couple of our really big players in the endocrine system sit, and that is the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So up right there in the mid-center of your brain are the two kind of master glands of the body, and the pituitary is actually considered the master gland. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary, and the pituitary controls everything else. Water-soluble hormones. So these are going to travel around floating in the blood because they easily dissolve into the blood. Some of them may be partially bound to other proteins. They cannot cross the plasma membrane or the cell membrane because it is a lipid bilayer, so they can't get through. So they're going to have to bind to receptors that are on the surface of those target cells. Once they are bound to a receptor, there's two mechanisms by which they can actually affect change, and that is going to be either to send a signal. So that's a second messenger type of thing. They bind and then a second messenger goes off and does the job. Or they can actually change to an enzyme and enter into the cell. The little table graph on the right-hand side is showing your water-soluble proteins, peptides and catecholamines. So you've heard of catecholamines, our fight or flight chemicals. These are water-soluble, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. The peptides, again, peptides are collections of amino acids bound together. So again, water-soluble proteins includes a whole huge list of things, including angiotensin II, which regulates our blood pressure, insulin, glucagon, both of which are going to regulate our blood sugar, and then many other common hormones such as oxytocin, prolactin, thyroid-stimulating hormones, etc. Lipid-soluble hormones are much fewer. So these do not dissolve in the blood. They do require transport on molecules because they can't just float around in the blood, so they're going to be carried around. But they can pass through the cell membrane once they get there. So we have another category called tyrosine-derived, and these are our thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Notice that TSH is not here. TSH is not a thyroid hormone, it's a thyroid stimulating hormone, very different. So TSH is a water-soluble hormone, but T3 and T4, which are the actual thyroid hormones, are lipid-soluble. And then we have all our steroids, which are going to be released by our kidneys, essentially, aldosterone, cortisol, cortisone. And we have some of our estrogen and progesterone-based androgens as well. So the list of lipid-soluble is much smaller. Factors that influence hormone production are going to include things like your circadian rhythm. So a lot of times when we talk about things like cortisol, what we're really referring to is kind of the normal biologic rhythm that you have where cortisol follows certain patterns within the body. The other things that are going to influence hormone production are going to be our emotions. So we know that if we're feeling stressed out, we're going to secrete catecholamines. We're going to trigger a fight or flight response. We're going to, through that whole kind of stress response, trigger other chemicals like cortisol level increases, et cetera, throughout the body. Tumors, if they get into certain areas, can cause overstimulation or oversecretion of certain hormones that may in turn affect other hormones. Liver disease, how we metabolize those hormones, whether or not we break them down, is going to change how much of that's present in our body. And then we can have drugs or surgery that can also affect it. And these are considered iatrogenic conditions. So when we talk about the endocrine glands, again, little picture up at the top, we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. But for most purposes, we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is kind of like the connector box that connects the pituitary to the nervous system. So your nervous system is functioning and doing all these things, but it needs some way of getting over and talking and communicating with the pituitary gland, because the pituitary gland is the one that actually goes out and says, what should we do for hormones? It's going to say, you know, the pituitary gland is going to talk to the thyroid gland, it's going to talk to the pancreas, it's going to talk to all these other areas. But the way that we connect the nervous system to the pituitary is actually through the hypothalamus. So that's really the entire function of the hypothalamus, is to make that connection between the pituitary gland and the nervous system. So that when you have a fight or flight response, that the pituitary can act appropriately. So the pituitary is called the master gland. This is the one that controls all the others. It controls the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the pancreas, your adrenal glands on your kidneys, pineal glands, the thymus, and the placenta, which is actually considered part of the endocrine system, which is a temporary gland because it's secreting hormones throughout the body. So essentially what the pituitary is doing, it is using information from your brain, i.e. the hypothalamus, and it is telling the other glands what they should do under different situations. So let's go through a little summary of the various glands of the endocrine system, and then we'll start looking at specific hormones and how they actually affect the body. So hypothalamus, again, the major purpose is to stimulate the pituitary gland. It is going to release things like antidiuretic hormone, ADH. It also releases oxytocin, and then a whole host of different kind of stimulating hormones that are going to communicate with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to release hormones such as luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormones, so all your reproductive kind of hormones, prolactin, so your hormone that causes lactation, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. This is very important. It comes from the pituitary and then affects the thyroid. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, which is going to then affect the kidneys. How much water should you be retaining? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, how much cortisol should you be producing, is going to be stimulated from the pituitary gland. So the adrenals, which is kind of the next step down, located on your kidneys, are the hormones that are the glands that are actually going to be stimulating a lot of your fight or flight, your sexual function, your erythropoietin, which is EPO, renin. So we're going to release adrenaline from there, noradrenaline, or also known as epinephrine, norepinephrine, aldosterone. This is our stress response type system. So these top three glands, and I want you to mark these down, hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals, are called the HPA axis. And this HPA axis controls a tremendous amount of what's going on throughout your body, including all your stress responses. The next gland that we have is the thyroid gland, which is basically going to secrete T4, and then T3 is going to be metabolized from T4. So T4 is kind of your inactive thyroid hormone. T3 is your active thyroid hormone. That's what you're actually really using when you use thyroid hormone. We then have the parathyroid gland, which is essentially a set of 4 small glands that sit right behind the thyroid and have to do with bone health. They're going to control calcium and phosphorus, the uptake, and how much do you need to retain and how much do you need to get rid of. And it's going to secrete parathyroid hormone. That's pretty straightforward. Basically, it's going to work on calcium and vitamin D regulation. The pancreas, as we all know, is our major gland that controls our blood sugar. So digestive and and endocrine, essentially glycemic control. When we think of the pancreas, we typically think of just insulin, but the pancreas actually does make other hormones that are actually part of glycemic control. And that's going to include glucagon and amylin, as well as another one called somatostatin. All of these 3 work together, 4 actually, including insulin, work together to control your blood sugar. Once we get past the pancreas, we have our sex glands, which are your ovaries and your testes. These are going to control sexual development, menstrual cycle for women, facial hair, et cetera, kind of all the sexual characteristics that we tend to associate. Interestingly enough, both men and women make portions of all of the chemicals that are secreted: progesterone, testosterone, estrogen. We all have a certain amount of both. The pineal gland is essentially your sleep cycle, melatonin, that's about all it does. And then the thymus gland, which is where we get our T cells, it's making the white blood cells, and they are maturing in the thymus gland before going out and hanging out in the lymphatic system. So hypothalamus, located above the pituitary gland and below the thalamus. As we said, it connects the nervous system to the endocrine system and controls homeostasis. So it's going to affect things like hunger, body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, because your body's got to send out these signals, and it's got to be interpreted through the hypothalamus in order to get the right response. It also is involved with motivational behavior, full control of the pituitary gland, and has a lot of releasing and inhibiting hormones. This is a list of some kind of really common hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. So antidiuretic hormone, which is going to increase your water reabsorption by the kidneys. Corticotropin releasing hormone, and you'll notice that there's always releasing attached to a lot of these hormones, because what they're doing is they're saying, go over to this area and release corticotropin. So this isn't corticotropin, it's the releasing hormone. It's the hormone that says, hey, let's make some more of this and let's put this out there. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. So here's another releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So these are hormones that are controlling the growth hormone, but are not the growth hormone in and of itself. Prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is the precursor to thyroid stimulating hormone. So these releasing hormones are up in the hypothalamus. They're communicating to the pituitary, which is then releasing a second hormone, which is then affecting a different site. So we've got almost a 3-step process going on here. So the pituitary, we have both the anterior and the posterior pituitary, and each do slightly different things. The posterior pituitary looks remarkably like testicles, but it's not. It just has that appearance. It's an anatomic extension of the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary is going to secrete ADH, antidiuretic, vasopressin, so you notice that that secretes ADH as well. Oxytocin, breastfeeding. Anterior pituitary is kind of your more predominantly active portion of pituitary with all the other releasing hormones, stimulated indirectly from the hypothalamus by all those inhibiting and releasing hormones that we just mentioned. So here are a list of the hormones produced by the pituitary. Anterior pituitary, we have our ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So that tells us it's going to go to the adrenal glands and tell them to release corticotropin or cortisol, to release cortisol. So this is going to stimulate them to produce cortisol. We have our thyroid stimulating hormone. So we had our thyroid releasing hormone, which comes down and causes thyroid stimulating hormone at the level of the pituitary. And that's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to release T4. So again, our little three-step process going on. Luteinizing hormone, which is going to go down and stimulate the ovaries, our next level down gland. Same with follicle stimulating hormone. And then growth hormone, which is going to stimulate kind of growth and repair. Posterior pituitary, again, as we mentioned, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, relates to control of the blood pressure through fluid levels in the kidney, water retention, and then oxytocin. So this is a fairly important concept. Hypothalamic pituitary axis is responsible for our stress response. A lot of times we call this the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so really it's kind of referring to all three of those because we start at the hypothalamus, we send messages to the pituitary, we send messages down to the adrenal cortex and the kidney, and that is how we stimulate our entire fight or flight response. So corticotropin releasing hormone, which is CRH up at the top, goes down to the pituitary, and adrenocorticotropic hormone is our next one, ACTH, followed by the release of cortisol, our stress chemical from the kidneys itself. The adrenal medulla also releases catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, et cetera. And then our body responds to the release of those specific catecholamines with increase in heart rate, vasoconstriction, anxiety, all those other things that we tend to associate with our stress responses. This is just a little cartoon that I thought was kind of cute. It's just illustrating the HPA feedback loop and how they're kind of essentially just communicating to each other back and forth, kind of yelling at each other through chemical messengers, essentially. So